So I am on the last chapter. So I bring to you chapter 12, which is Time and Tides. I will tell you, this is a great chapter, and it kind of focuses on a patient with OCD, but I feel like there are so many gems that we could all learn and pick up from that. And I'm in my car to try and be out of direct sunlight, but also give you some beautiful trees and background. So there you go. All right. So in chapter 12, he starts by talking about how the brain and the prefrontal cortex is really focused on continuity and coherence. And you've heard that over and over again in this book, because he talks about how we can use the AAI and other things to look at people's own narratives of themselves. And when you talk about your narrative, the things that stand out are the continuity and the coherence of that. What that does is it allows the brain to connect the past, the present, and the future. And that gives ourselves a feeling of security and also control. So it's kind of like a safety feature that the brain really likes to have. And then then he goes into talking a little bit about permanence. And it's kind of interesting because he says that there's this drive for permanence and certainty, but we also have this ability to process all of the information that's coming into us. And if we really pay attention to our prefrontal cortex, we know that life is temporary. And I thought this was so interesting because he makes the analogy of saying, pets, for instance, he was once asked by his children if the dog knew that they were going to die. And he was saying there is something distinctly human about understanding mortality, and that most animals don't think that way. They live without a prefrontal cortex in the now, which I think is kind of beautiful, because when I talk about neuroscience and I talk about personal growth and I talk about how you can really work on yourself, some of the things that I talk about are using meditation and mindfulness to be present. So there's something really interesting about our ability to have a prefrontal cortex, distinctly human, but also have to get over that to stay present. So I think it's kind of really interesting about living in the moment. He then talks about the prefrontal cortex and says, don't get me wrong, the prefrontal cortex is amazing because it allows you to plan, it allows you to dream, it allows you to imagine, and it allows you to reflect on everything that's happened. So it allows you to reinvent yourself, which again is one of those distinctly human traits, which is kind of beautiful. I just love that. I know, lots of notes for the last chapter. And he touches back on the self-narrative, saying that in this way of being coherent and having continuity, remember that our brain fills in gaps. So I thought this was interesting because I don't think about this often, but I do read a lot of neuroscience books. So this was interesting because he was saying, remember, even how we experience daily life in vision, we blink. And therefore, we actually have disrupted vision because you don't have a constant flow. However, your brain learns to fill in those little mini gaps, and so that you have a coherent, continuous picture of what's going on. It's not like you see flashes. It's a continuous picture. And I thought that was such a cool analogy of how the brain really works in those things. And I'm sure, and it makes me think about all those puzzles where you see that the brain will fill in gaps, whether that's memory gaps. Just so you know, your brain will also fill in memory gaps. They're not always truthful, which is part of the problem when I've talked about that before, when you deal with witnesses. It's really hard because the human brains will fill in those gaps with what they think makes the most sense to have a coherent and continuous story in their mind. It's super interesting to me. And so that's kind of the background that he gives before he talks about his patient. And this is a young patient who is showing new signs of OCD. And I will tell you, I haven't up until this point researched a lot about OCD. So this was kind of interesting just to get a picture of what he was saying about it, because I haven't studied it before. What he said and how he kind of looks and views OCD is OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, is a disorder in which you have recurrent thoughts and obsessions. Oftentimes it's in the form of frightening images or irrational ideas that like are constant and recurrent. And what happens is the person gets stuck in compulsions, which could be, for example, washing your hands or turning a lock, or obsessions as far as rituals like tapping, rubbing, different things of this nature. This was also interesting, which he'll bring up later, is I did not realize that strep infection can actually bring about OCD. I'm going to pause that and put that later. Strep has a lot of conditions. Strep also has been known to cause PANS and pandas in young kids. It's a really interesting disease that we don't think a lot about. We think about like having strep and going to the doctor and taking antibiotics and being done with it. But it can do a lot inside our bodies. So it's super interesting to me, and I'll touch on that later. So when he looks at this patient, his kind of approach was that this is a new phenomenon that's been going on, and he did kind of go about and make sure that she didn't have a recent strep infection and all of that stuff. And he wasn't sure where this came about from, but he was up for trying to work with this patient, and her parents were up for this without medication to begin with, to just see where they landed. And so what he does is, again, very Dan Siegel, which is why I love him. It's brilliant because he kind of takes this idea of what's going on in her head and makes it really simple for everybody, including her, to understand. So he's saying, if he was going to talk about OCD, what he'll say is, there are different parts of your brain that all work together. There's information from the brainstem and the limbic system. There's the amygdala. There's the FFF center, right? The freeze, fight, or flee. And there's the prefrontal cortex, which is involved in all the worrying and planning, okay? And in general, he says these work together to form this kind of, if you think about it as a checker system, right? This is a survival system that basically is your consciousness trying to figure out if there is danger and then being able to avoid the danger. It's brilliant, right? So this checker, he says, has 3 parts to it. Brilliant. The checker has, the first part is scanning. So S is scanning for danger. So it scans for danger, whether, it's how it's perceiving all of these things, and it's looking for danger. The second thing it does is it alerts the fear and anxiety in a person, right? It lets them know that there's danger around. And then the last thing it does is it motivates that person to take action to avoid that danger. Now, when I talk about that, I've often talked about that with FFF and how that is a very important survival mechanism. We absolutely need that to happen. However, there are times that people's checker gets over excited. It's in like hyperdrive. And when that happens, it kind of skews everything off base. Now, I also thought this was really interesting. He said, oftentimes there is a link to an overactive checker doing these things and linking it back to OCD and these rituals or obsessive behaviors. And he said a lot of times that's because we have grown up and our brain has these old rituals of like, and if you think about it, almost every culture has these like good and bad luck, right? Like things you don't do, right? Like I don't step on a crack. I don't go under an open ladder. I don't open an umbrella under a house. And the belief is if you do these things, you will cause bad luck, something bad to happen. And there's also the opposite. If you do certain things, right? Like if you spill salt, but you throw it over your shoulder, then you don't have the bad luck. So these are cultural things that you can go through. I mean, for me, I can find them in almost all of the historical cultural books that I have read. So your brain already latches onto that. And in this system, it does the same thing. It latches on to the obsessive or compulsive component. And it makes you think if you don't do that, the bad thing that you're thinking about is going to happen. And so this is kind of the basis of where OCD takes hold in a person's brain and being. All right. Also, he says, please do not ever think that this is not intense. So for the person experiencing this, it feels like life or death because it is our survival system. That checker is based on survival, which is life or death. It is not like a menial thing. It is felt, embodied as life or death, right? And so he explains this to the patient and he says, so here's the thing. I think we can focus on the mind and start to change the brain and how it's reacting, which is kind of beautiful. And he's going to use the same techniques that I've talked about at the previous chapters. So he's going to start with step number 1, which is mindfulness and meditation. So he's teaching basic meditation and mindfulness, 5 to 10 minutes a day. He wants just an observation. And it's so funny. I hear him in my head because I say this to clients all the time, that awareness is the first step. So until we can truly be aware, right, of where we're starting, of where we are, of what's happening in the moment, we can't make any permanent changes. And this is kind of his first step too, right? He's teaching to observe the self, observe the mind, and see where we're at. The second, this is also something I've said in the past, is he wants to create space in between, right, the end rituals that are happening and the impulse to do them. And I say this all the time. What I try to do with my clients is create space between being triggered and an action. If we can increase that space, it allows us to utilize tools in between, which is the same thing he's done. No wonder I love him. So in this case, he's really encouraging the client to use that name it and tame it part, recognizing that the checker is kind of going crazy and being able to differentiate from an immediate need to act, right? And realizing that is a brain impulse that is telling me danger. It doesn't mean there is actual danger, right? And I think that's really important. you have to have awareness in that first step. And then you have to be able to name whatever is happening and talk out loud to it, if preferably. That's the neuro-linguistic part that he doesn't talk about, but there is a distinct reason for talking out loud. And be able to kind of differentiate it from yourself. Like, this is not real danger. I feel it as danger. And I understand that this is my brain alerting me because it thinks there's danger. Okay. The third part he does is he self-talks. So actually, I take that back. He does say self-talk. And here he's really going in. This is so interesting because I've been working with clients on internal family systems, which is about having these different parts of your personality and talking to them to process through things of past and present and how you deal with things and how they come about. And it's really interesting that he brought this up. He said, engage the checker, that system, by self-talk. In other words, you've named it as a part and you've differentiated from it. And now you can tell it that, listen, I appreciate that you are trying to protect me. And I am so grateful that you're there to keep me safe. And I know it is a loving act. And I also want you to know that you're a little bit enthusiastic at this point, and I have this. You don't have to worry. I kind of got this. All right. Beautiful. This is what I was talking about. The neuro-linguistic part of that is it's important for your brain to hear in your own words, actually, you say that, because it starts a new neural pathway. It's really, really important. And then the fourth step was to reduce the rituals that they're using, right? So you can also do this. He says he had the person do it also in self-talk. So I know that you think, hi checker, I know you think that I need to tap 5 times or 10 times in order for bad things not to happen. I think that today 8 is enough. We're going to just tap the 8 times. I hear you, and we're going to do the 8. And so what he does in essence by every time this happens is he allows the brain to interact space in between and the tools of self-talk, right? And to calm down, right? And to be in charge. And he's decreasing rituals at the same thing. So it's really interesting because he's not actually looking at the underlying reason for the checker to go off. Instead, he's working on the neural pathways, right? He's saying prefrontal cortex is happening. That's going to the cingulate cortex, remember, which causes anxiety, which then, influences the body and the emotions, right? And instead, he's kind of working on that pathway to back it up. Let's just back it up. I feel it in the body, so now I'm going to back it up. Hey, I see that this is happening. We're going to back that up. We're just going to back that up. So it's actually really interesting because he's coming at it from a different point than a lot of therapies do, which a lot of therapies try to pinpoint the trigger and deal with tools to help with that. And this in particular, he's literally going right to that brain pattern to try and change. So here's where he then makes a little caveat into the strep link. I find this fascinating. So there is also a part of the brain that is involved in OCD and this whole process of the checker. It's called the caudate nucleus. This is the part of the brain that shifts gears, right? So it can change your course of action. And if it gets stuck on, for example, it can create this like never ending worry and agitation, right? So what's really interesting is that strep has been found to affect the caudate nucleus. So it almost like instantaneously instigates OCD behavior because the person can't get out of this worry, and it's like a physical cause of that, and so therefore they're stuck in this. Then I think that's so fascinating. I mean, I think I could read a whole thing about diseases and how they affect the body long term, which I realize can be really controversial at this point in time. So I guess I will stop and pause there and say that's a conversation I would love to have sometime. All right. So he then kind of ends up at the end of this chapter, and I think, I can't remember because I read the epilogue as well, so I think this is still the end of this chapter. He's basically talking again, reiterating his approach of Mindsight, which is making sure a person is in the open and receptive state, that they're using observation to label things, name it and taming it. They're using dialogue and negotiation techniques. And for me, this really rings true of IFS stuff because you have a protector, you have exile, release. It's the same kind of patterning that you're using if you're using that modality to go through this. Basically, he says, I want to get the person to a point where there's serenity, there's courage, there's wisdom, and that really only comes with acceptance, which I thought was beautiful because it leads back to radical acceptance and why I did that book. He also has a part in this chapter where he talks a little bit about death and a different patient who gets stuck on death because of losing someone. And he makes the point that I would like to highlight is that children who experience big events early on in their life tend to have them come up again as they go through other big milestones. So like this patient lost somebody close at a very young age, and then when they're going through the different milestones of adolescence, they feel that come back up. All right, and he also used meditation to really help alleviate that through the different milestones, which is another big thing if you've done any social emotional learning stuff, or if your kids are in school, why they're teaching meditation techniques so early and mindfulness techniques is exactly this, because they may not know what has happened in a kid's life, but they know that through meditation they can help through it. All right, and I think that kind of wraps up in general that book. It was fantastic. I hope you read along. All of my little reviews by chapter are on my YouTube channel, Best Self, Best Health. You can see them there. If you have questions, you can comment on there or on my page, and I'm happy to discuss or get back to them. If you have a book that you're dying to see me review in such a way, let me know. And I really think that some of these things you can really take home. That idea of having mindsight and mindfulness, about not ignoring our history, because even though you think it doesn't impact you, it does impact you in some way. Finding the support you need to have a coherent narrative and really work and flourish from within with personal growth. Like, that is my whole mission to help people with. So I wish you guys a fantastic week, and I will see you soon in another live.